I didn't believe cemeteries were haunted. I believed they were documented. But in 3 different towns, at 3 different graveyards, the same thing kept happening after midnight. Paths I didn't remember walking. Names that wouldn't stay the same. And places that felt occupied even when no one was there. I took the night shift at Union Cemetery in Easton, Connecticut, because I needed the money and because I told myself that quiet was better than people. Union Cemetery sits just off Sport Hill Road, tucked behind a line of trees that barely blocks the headlights from passing cars. And if you grew up anywhere near Fairfield County, you knew its name even if you pretended not to. People liked to mention it in passing, usually with a smirk, usually followed by the same story about the White Lady, the woman in a flowing dress said to appear near the graves after midnight, a story that dates back at least to the late 1800s and was serious enough that it ended up in regional historical records and paranormal investigations decades later. I didn't believe in any of that. What I believed in was rent, overdue bills, and the fact that the town paid extra for overnight security because vandalism had become a problem after a string of late-night dares involving local teenagers. The job was simple on paper. Walk the grounds once every hour, check the gates, log anything unusual, sit in the small security shed between rounds, and watch the cameras that covered the main paths and older sections of the cemetery. No weapons, no dogs, no dramatics, just presence. I told myself that a place full of dead people was probably safer than most places full of living ones. And for the first few nights, that seemed true. Union Cemetery at night isn't loud or theatrical. There are no owls screeching on cue. No wind howling through the headstones like something out of a movie. It's quiet in a way that feels administrative, like the silence of an office building after hours. You hear your own footsteps on gravel, the faint hum of traffic in the distance, and occasionally, the sound of leaves brushing against stone markers that date back to the Revolutionary War. Easton itself is old, older than people think, and Union Cemetery reflects that. Some of the graves belong to soldiers who fought in conflicts most Americans barely remember, and the stones are worn down to the point where names blur into shallow grooves. On my 3rd night, I noticed something that didn't feel wrong enough to report, but felt strange enough that I wrote it down anyway. My patrol log showed that I had marked the same path twice, even though I was certain I hadn't walked it a second time. The cemetery paths aren't complicated, but they're distinct. There's the main loop near the entrance, the narrow trail that cuts through the older section, and a sloping path that leads toward a cluster of family plots near the back. I remembered turning left. The log said I'd gone right. I assumed I'd made a mistake, chalked it up to fatigue, and moved on. The cameras showed nothing out of place. No movement, no shadows, just rows of headstones under infrared light, frozen and grainy. By the end of the first week, I started to understand why the town insisted on keeping written patrol logs instead of switching entirely to digital. There's something grounding about writing things down, about seeing your own handwriting confirm that time is passing the way it's supposed to. But it was also the logs that made it harder to ignore what was happening. Each night, the entries grew more detailed, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because I felt an increasing need to prove to myself that I was still in control of my routine. I began noting exact times, weather conditions, even smells. Damp earth, old stone, cut grass lingering from earlier that day. The smell was strongest near the northern section of the cemetery, where the oldest graves are, and where, according to local legend, the White Lady was most often seen. Historical records from the late 19th century mention a woman named Hannah Cranna, sometimes linked to the legend, sometimes dismissed as a convenient name attached to an older story. What mattered to me wasn't whether she existed, but that the cemetery had been the subject of written accounts for over a century. People had been standing on that same ground, feeling watched, long before cameras or security sheds existed. Around midnight, on my 9th shift, I heard footsteps that weren't mine. That's the moment everyone expects in a story like this. The moment where you either run or you don't. But the truth is less dramatic. The sound was soft, irregular, like someone walking slowly on gravel, stopping and starting without a clear pattern. I froze, listened, and waited for it to stop. It didn't. I called out, identified myself as security, and felt ridiculous as my voice disappeared into the trees. There was no response. The sound moved farther away, toward the older section. I followed, flashlight steady, heart rate elevated but not panicked. The beam swept over stones, over names and dates, over small flags left from Memorial Day. Nothing moved. No one stood between the graves. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the edge of the old section, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. When I checked the cameras afterward, there was nothing. No flicker. No anomaly. Just me, alone, moving through empty paths. I wrote it down anyway. The town supervisor skimmed my logs once a week. He never commented on them, just initialed the pages and moved on. I don't think he expected to find anything, and I didn't expect him to. By the second week, the cemetery felt smaller, not physically, but in the way familiar places shrink once you know them too well. I could walk the paths without thinking. And that's when I started noticing changes I couldn't explain. A path that felt longer than it should have. A row of stones that seemed to repeat, names blurring together until I couldn't remember if I'd passed them already. Once, near 1:30 a.m., I found myself standing at the back gate, keys in hand, with no memory of walking there. The log said I'd completed my round. My watch said otherwise. I told myself I was tired. That night work messes with your sense of time, and I leaned harder into routine. Same order, same pace, same notes. But routine only works when the environment cooperates. On the night everything shifted, the air felt wrong from the start. Too still. No insects. No distant traffic. Even the usual hum of the cameras inside the shed sounded muted, like it was being absorbed by the walls. During my first patrol, I noticed a new indentation in the gravel near one of the older graves, as if someone had knelt there recently. The grave belonged to a man who died in 1882, according to the stone, and there were no flowers, no tokens, no signs of a visit, just disturbed earth. I didn't touch it. I logged it and moved on. The second patrol took longer than usual. I kept feeling like I was being pulled off course. Subtle shifts in direction that didn't register until I was already walking somewhere I hadn't planned to go. That's when I saw her, or what I think was her, standing near a line of weathered stones close to the center of the old section. She wasn't glowing. She wasn't translucent. She looked like a woman standing still, wearing something light-colored, her back turned to me. For a second, I felt relief. A trespasser meant rules, procedures, something solid. I called out again, louder this time. She didn't turn. I took a step closer, and that's when I realized the distance between us wasn't closing the way it should have. No matter how many steps I took, she remained just far enough away that her features stayed indistinct. The air grew colder, not in a dramatic way, but in the way basements are colder than the rest of a house. A practical cold that settles into your bones. I stopped walking. She didn't move. After a long moment, she began to drift, not walk, toward the trees, her outline blurring until it was impossible to tell where she ended and the shadows began. When she was gone, the silence returned, deeper than before. I didn't chase her. I didn't run. I stood there until my legs started to shake. Then I walked back to the shed and locked the door. The cameras showed nothing. Not her. Not me standing still for nearly 10 minutes. The timestamps skipped forward as if nothing had happened. I wrote the longest entry I'd written yet. Hands unsteady, trying to anchor the experience in words. I referenced the legend for the first time, not as belief, but as context. Historical note. Repeated sightings reported near this section since 1800s. Possible psychological factor. The supervisor didn't initial that page. He tore it out. When I asked him about it the next day, he told me, without looking up, that the town preferred logs to stay factual. No stories, no speculation. I should have quit then. Instead, I went back. Part of me needed to understand whether what I'd seen was tied to the place, to the legend, or to something breaking down inside me. The final night I worked there, I arrived early and found the front gate already unlocked. The shed light was on. Inside, the patrol log lay open to a page I hadn't written yet. My handwriting filled the lines, neat and precise, describing a route I hadn't taken, noting a time that hadn't occurred. The last line read, "Completed final round. Stayed until she stopped following." I didn't hear footsteps that night. I didn't see her again. What I felt was worse. A presence behind me during every patrol, close enough that I could feel the absence of space, like the air itself had been displaced. When dawn finally came, I walked out without looking back, left my keys on the desk, and never returned. The town never called. Union Cemetery still stands, still quiet, still listed in historical records as one of the most haunted cemeteries in New England, though the language is more careful now. Sightings reported. Accounts vary. No official confirmation. Sometimes, when I drive past Sport Hill Road at night, I glance toward the trees and think about the paths I didn't remember walking, the logs that knew more than I did, and the idea that some places don't want to be watched, only accompanied, slowly, until you don't notice you're no longer alone. I didn't take the job at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland because I cared about history or the dead. I took it because my father was buried there, and because after he died, I needed somewhere quiet enough that my thoughts couldn't follow me. Lakeview Cemetery isn't small, and it isn't obscure. Presidents are buried there. James A. Garfield's monument rises above the trees like a stone lighthouse. And the cemetery itself has been part of Cleveland since the 1,860 carefully mapped, meticulously archived, its records preserved through fires, expansions, and decades of urban change. That was part of why the job appealed to me. Records don't lie, I told myself. Dates don't drift. Names don't change. My position was technically administrative, but it came with night access, and that was the part I wanted. I was responsible for cross-referencing headstone inscriptions with the cemetery's internal burial database as part of a long-term preservation project. Vandals had damaged several older sections over the years. Weather had worn away names, and the board wanted a verified digital record tied directly to what was physically present on the grounds. Simple work. Walk a section during the day, log inscriptions, confirm them against the archives at night. Flag discrepancies. I started with the older western plots, where the stones leaned slightly and the ground felt softer, as if it still remembered being turned by hand. The first discrepancy appeared on my fourth night, and it was small enough that I almost missed it. A marble headstone listed the name Eleanor Weiss, born 1849, died 1871. The database listed the same dates, but the surname was spelled Weiss. I assumed a transcription error, made a note, and moved on. The next night, the stone read Eleanor Weiss. I noticed because I had taken a photo the previous evening, and the letters were carved differently, deeper, cleaner, as if the stone had been recut. I checked the maintenance logs. No work orders, no replacements, no restorations scheduled for that section. I told myself I had misread it the first time. That's what exhaustion does. It convinces you that memory is flexible. Over the next week, I found 3 more discrepancies, all minor. A middle initial where there hadn't been one. A surname off by a single letter. Each time, the database and the stone disagreed. And each time, the following night, they matched again, but not always the same version. It wasn't random. It was as if the names were oscillating between possibilities. I stopped trusting photographs and began sketching the stones by hand, noting chisel marks, erosion patterns, the weight of the letters themselves. The stones weren't being swapped. They weren't being vandalized. The changes were subtle but physical. You could feel them if you ran your fingers across the grooves. Lakeview's archives go back far enough that you can track families through generations. And buried in those records are references most visitors never see. Cholera outbreaks in the 1832. Mass graves relocated during expansion. Names recorded hastily during periods when the city was overwhelmed. One night, while cross-checking a particularly stubborn discrepancy, I came across a ledger entry from 1872, noting that several burial names had been corrected for accuracy following review, without further explanation. That phrase appeared again in 1881, then 1919, always following periods of widespread death. I started to feel like I was stepping into an argument that had been ongoing for more than a century. The hook, the thing that kept me coming back, despite the growing sense of unease, was my father's plot. He was buried in a newer section. Clean stone, laser-etched lettering, nothing ambiguous. I visited his grave every night before I left, a habit I didn't log. On the 10th night, his middle name was wrong, not misspelled, different, entirely. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the hospital called. I checked the database immediately. It listed the wrong name too. I pulled up older backups. The change propagated backward, as if it had always been that way. That's when I stopped assuming error and started assuming intent. I began arriving earlier, staying later, sleeping in my car between shifts, just to watch the grounds under different light. The cemetery has cameras, but they're focused on entrances and monuments, not individual plots. At night, Lakeview feels less like a resting place and more like a city with its lights turned off. Paths stretch farther than they should. Sounds carry oddly. I started to notice that the changes only occurred overnight, between the hours of 1:17 and 3 a.m. A window that appeared again and again in old maintenance notes, usually attached to vague comments like records updated or stones adjusted. On a cold night in October, I decided to stay inside the western section during that window. I hid between two large family monuments, notebook in hand, breath fogging the air. Nothing happened at first. Then the ground began to sound different. Not movement, exactly, but pressure, like weight being redistributed beneath the soil. I focused on a single headstone, one I had memorized. The name belonged to a man who died during the Civil War, listed as unknown soldier in several records. As I watched, the letters seemed to darken, shadows deepening inside the grooves. Slowly, impossibly, new letters emerged, not rising from the stone, but clarifying, as if they had always been there and were only now being permitted to exist. A name formed. I didn't recognize it, but when I checked the archives later, I found it buried in a casualty list, crossed out, replaced with another. The implications settled over me like damp soil. Names here were not fixed because they had never been agreed upon. Lakeview had been correcting itself, over and over, adjusting the record to match something older than paperwork. My father's grave changed again the following night. This time, the surname was mine, but the first name wasn't his. It was mine. I didn't sleep after that. I combed through historical accounts, found references to a local legend that never made it into official tours, about the cemetery being a place where the dead argued over who they were remembered as, where names were not memorials but negotiations. One account from the early 1900s described caretakers refusing to work certain sections after dark because the stones would not settle. The final hook came when I found a ledger entry dated the night before my father died, noting a preemptive correction. There was no name listed, just a blank line and my handwriting, unmistakable, beneath it. I quit the job the next morning. I don't visit the cemetery anymore. The database now lists my name twice, once with a date in the future, once without. Lakeview Cemetery remains open to the public, its records pristine, its history celebrated. But sometimes, when I wake up just after 2 a.m., I can feel something pressing gently against my chest, like a reminder, and I wonder which version of my name is currently winning. The sign at the edge of Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia doesn't say anything about midnight, but everyone who lives nearby knows the rule anyway. Laurel Hill sits along the Schuylkill River, established in 1836, one of the first garden cemeteries in the United States. A place where people once brought picnic baskets and sketchbooks, where poets, generals, and industrialists were buried beneath carefully planned trees and winding paths. By day, it's a historical landmark. By night, it's something else entirely. I learned the rule during my first week working there, not from a supervisor, but from an older groundskeeper who'd been trimming hedges longer than I'd been alive. People stop visiting after midnight, he told me casually, as if discussing weather. Not because the gates are locked, because after that, it's not really for them anymore. I laughed it off at the time. I took the overnight caretaker position because it came with housing assistance, and because my life had collapsed quietly enough that I didn't trust myself around crowds. My wife had left earlier that year, not in a dramatic way, but with a stack of boxes and a note that said she needed to stop feeling like she was already dead. Laurel Hill felt like the right place for someone who didn't know how to be fully present anymore. The job involved routine checks, minor maintenance, and logging any disturbances. No security patrols like modern cemeteries, just observation. The administration trusted history to discourage trouble. For the first few nights, nothing challenged that trust. The cemetery settled after dark. The river carried sound away. The city lights reflected faintly off marble and granite, and the mausoleums cast long, steady shadows. I walked the paths, noted fallen branches, checked gates, and spent most of my shift sitting on a bench, overlooking the water, listening to it move. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't visual. It was auditory. At exactly 12:07 a.m., on my fifth night, the ambient noise changed. The river didn't stop flowing, but it sounded farther away, as if a door had closed between us. The distant traffic faded. Even the insects went quiet. It wasn't silence. It was containment. I checked my watch twice, then my phone. Everything worked. Time moved forward. I wrote it down and continued my rounds. That night, I noticed footprints near a family plot from the mid-1800s. Narrow impressions in the gravel that led between the stones and then stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to need the ground. No exit trail, no disturbance beyond that point. The next morning, the footprints were gone. The gravel looked untouched. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Subtle changes after midnight, sounds dulling, distances stretching. Once, I walked from the main gate to the monument of General George Meade, a path I could normally traverse in under 3 minutes. It took nearly 10, and when I turned back, the gate seemed farther away than it should have been, framed by darkness that felt thicker than the night around it. I began researching Laurel Hill's history during my off hours, digging past the tourist-friendly narratives. Buried in old Philadelphia records were references to a period during the yellow fever outbreaks of the late 1700s. Before Laurel Hill officially existed, when bodies were interred hastily along the riverbanks, often without markers. Later, when the cemetery was established, some of those remains were relocated. Others weren't. The records were unclear. What was clear was that multiple caretakers over the decades had resigned abruptly, citing exhaustion or illness, their final logs ending around the same hours I was now watching so closely. On the night everything escalated, a light rain fell just before midnight, slicking the paths and darkening the stones. I watched the clock deliberately this time. At 11:59 p.m., the cemetery felt normal. At 12, the air changed. Not colder, heavier. I stood near an old section overlooking the river and watched as footprints appeared in the wet gravel ahead of me, one by one, forming a path that led deeper into the cemetery. No one emerged to make them. They simply manifested, pressed into the earth, as if by an invisible weight. Against every instinct I had, I followed. The path wound through older and older plots, past stones so worn their inscriptions were barely legible. As I walked, I noticed something unsettling about the graves themselves. Many of them bore no signs of visitation, no flowers, no flags, no tokens, just stone and earth. And yet, after midnight, it felt crowded. Not with figures, but with presence. Like standing in a room where people have just stepped out of view. I stopped near a low stone marked with a date from 1798. One of the worst years of the yellow fever epidemic. The name was barely readable. As I watched, the rainwater pooled in the grooves of the letters, darkening them until the name stood out sharply, clearer than it had any right to be. Around me, other stones seemed to do the same, names emerging from erosion, as if responding to attention. I realized then that nothing here wanted to be remembered in daylight. Memory required witnesses, and witnesses required the right hour. The final hook came when I saw my own footprints ahead of me, fresh, leading toward a section I hadn't yet visited that night. I followed them until they stopped in front of an unmarked patch of ground near the river's edge. No stone, no plaque, just disturbed earth, as if waiting. The soundscape closed in tighter than ever before. I felt the weight of the place press against my chest, not threatening, but expectant. I thought about my wife's note, about how she said she felt erased long before she left. And I understood then that Laurel Hill didn't take people. It offered them a place to stop being overlooked. At 12:31 a.m., the pressure lifted. Sounds returned in pieces. The river crept back into hearing. I walked away without looking behind me. I submitted my resignation the next day. The administration didn't ask why. Laurel Hill Cemetery still allows visitors after dark for special events, tours, and historical walks, all carefully scheduled to end before midnight. The rule remains unofficial, unposted. No one enforces it. And yet, if you stand near the gates after midnight, you won't see anyone trying to enter. The paths stay empty, the gravel undisturbed, because some places remember who they're for. And after midnight, Laurel Hill remembers the ones who never got to leave.